Good morning and welcome to Tuesday's session of the 2021 AIA Fall Conference. We are here at the Wadman Center, our headquarters for AIA Utah. And I'm Robert Pignon, the chair and today's AV moderator. We want to just quickly announce that each of the events this week is hosted by a different committee from the AIA Utah chapter. Today we will be featuring our Government Affairs Committee, and I will now turn the time over to Warren Lloyd, who will introduce today's event. Just one second, Warren.
Welcome, friends, to the 2021 AIA Utah Connect, Collaborate, Celebrate Hybrid Conference, held digitally and in person here at the AIA Utah headquarters in the Wadman Center in the historic Ford building. We're very grateful to our sponsors for their financial support this year. Thank you to our platinum sponsor, Alder Sales Corporation, our gold sponsors, BHB Structural Engineers, Hogan Construction, Steelcase, Midwest Office Commercial, and Reevely Engineers. Thank you to our silver sponsors, Steel Encounters and Wadman Corporation, and our print sponsor, SBR Technologies. We are excited for the Citizen Architect Panel, Advocate for Your Profession, which will be moderated by RK Stewart, FAIA. We'll turn the time now to RK to introduce the panel.
Thanks, Warren. This is goals up there. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning to talk about architects in public life. As the co-chair with Jackson Ferguson, we try and advocate for the profession as well as our communities around the state of Utah. As Ambassador Richard Sweat, FAIA, the only architect to serve in Congress in the 20th century, wrote in his book, Leadership by Design. Since the Institute was founded in 1857, architects have always played a significant role in creating not just the buildings that create our built environment, but also the legislation, the rules, the regulations that go behind it. So we actually, in government affairs, actually kind of wear two hats. One is to protect the profession, but also to advance the kinds of rules and regulations that enable us to do our jobs better for the public we serve. So today we've got 4 citizen architects here, each who've been playing a different role in their communities. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you now. Darin, take us off.
Thanks. Okay, I'm Darin Mano. I am serving currently in Salt Lake City Council. I represent District 5, which is around Liberty Park. I started through community councils and planning commission and other boards and commissions, and then was appointed to the council last year.
Sure.
I'm Jared Ma. I work here at Salt Lake for Richardson Design Partnership. I also am serving on the board as the immediate past president for AIA Utah. And I've been serving on the planning commission in Plain City, Utah for the past 14 years.
All right. Waiting for the camera. Okay.
I didn't see that.
All right. So I'm Peggy McDonough, and I have, I'm president of MHTN Architects, but I spent many times on boards and commissions, particularly Salt Lake City Planning Commission for 8 years during the time when City Creek center was being approved, and a lot of post-Olympic and all the things that we see today coming up on infill projects around the city were being approved, and Sugar House was also being approved for all the density at that time. And several years on Saratoga Springs Urban Design Board, right when the city was starting, and then also the Art Design Board, which selects architects for Salt Lake City.
I'm Jackson Ferguson, principal at FFKR Architects, and I currently serve on the Heritage City Planning Commission, which I've done for 4 years. It's very interesting to serve in a rapidly expanding suburb of the city. We've grown from 1998, about 2,000 residents to 50,000 residents. So the growth has been amazing, and there's another plan on the books for 30,000 residents. So the growth is just continuing, and there's a lot of things to go through.
So Jackson, how did you come to be on that planning commission? What of that role?
So actually, it started with a city newsletter. The city sent out a notice that they needed more planning commissioners. And I felt that I had an opportunity and even an obligation, I would say, to serve with the background that I have, knowing that I can help my own city, help my neighbors. Jumped in and applied, and loved having brought me in. So it was an interview process. So I got interviewed, well, 2 interviews actually, ultimately approved by the city council.
Peggy, how did you get on?
So it was always by invitation. Always somebody in the community, at the time for Salt Lake City, it was a planning director who reached out and called. And they were particularly looking for architects, voices on these boards. And for Saratoga Springs, it was a professor at the university who happened to be working with Saratoga Springs. So it was really through networking and connection and invitation.
Darin?
So my family's lived in Plain City for 8 generations now. So our name's pretty well known within the city. And back in 2007, when I first got my architecture license, city councilman and the mayor actually came to my house and asked me if I would consider filling a vacancy on the planning commission at the time. And that's how I got started.
Darin, you got perhaps the most interesting path.
Yeah, so I moved into my home about 6 years ago, and I went to my first community council meeting, and it happened to be the time that they were having elections, and I said, sure, I'll do that. And then that was also about the same time that Court Utley, who is currently has been staff member for the RDA, had reached out to me. I had applied for an RDA project, one of the RFPs, and I did not win that commission, but I guess impressed the court enough that he had asked me to apply for the redevelopment advisory committee. So those 2 things were kind of happening at the same time. And then fast forward a couple of years later, and I had presented in front of the planning commission one of my projects that the planning commission actually did not recommend for approval. But in that same meeting, the planning director had said, hey, we need more planning commissioners. So I thought, well, I'll apply for this position, and was on the planning commission for about 6 months when the mayor, who was at that time my city council member, was elected. And so her city council seat was vacant, and I applied for that as well. So currently right now is the only time that I actually am running for office. Or the first time I'm actually campaigning, but everything else was sort of application and appointment.
So running for office, what's that been like thus far? I mean, we're not there yet, but.
Yeah, we're not quite there. We're right in the thick of it, but it's a very different experience. Actually, it's I think every action and everything I do is more highly scrutinized than I think it's ever been in my life, which is a very new thing to kind of deal with. But I do love talking. I think I like meeting people. I love talking with people, and so knocking on doors has been actually a lot of fun. I like meeting my neighbors, and so I think that that's a role of campaigning I actually really enjoy, is just connecting with neighbors.
So anybody out there who wants to help you
Come
in
knock
your
doors
race,
with me every Saturday until November.
every Saturday, go knock doors. So we know architects have a unique skill set. Vision a future that doesn't exist, and explain how to get there. So how does that skill set really impact your work, either on the council or on the planning commissions? Darin, what's your?
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot of people, when people ask me why I became an architect, I think my reason is that it's very broad. You have to look at artistic things, you have to look at technical things, you have to understand sociology and how organizations function. And I think that's very similar to work on the city council. I have to look at to learn how a sewer treatment plant functions, and then understand what tax increment is. And there's all this very broad sort of skill set and knowledge that we need to gain in order to be good city council members. And I think it's the exact same as being a good architect. We have to be able to balance a lot of competing interests. think it actually, I think more architects are very sort of naturally trained to be public service.
Sure.
You know, in my town, as far as I can tell, I'm the only licensed architect that lives in Plain City, and the first one in the history of the town. So this is, yeah, it's kind of interesting. But more than once, I've sat on a planning commission meeting, and all eyes turn to me, and the question is, Jared, you're an architect. What do you think about this? Whether it's a development or a standard we're trying to work on, and I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but my opinion is pretty valued by these people, and as swayed votes. I think you can all say you've had that experience where that, you know, your opinion is considered and respected, and you know, it's an interesting dynamic.
So what are the skill sets of the other members of your planning commission?
So they're varying. We actually have an individual with a planning background. Let's see, the other one that we have, I'm trying to think, is one's a homemaker. Another one at one time was a sales rep for a fence company. You know? So it's got a varied background. We have had realtors on our commission before, and we try to get people with differing backgrounds on the commission, even different opinions, because it's just good to get that different perspective. You know, so I see things differently than, say, Commissioner Faulkner, who is a homemaker, you know, sees things, and it's good to have those different opinions because we can collaborate a lot better.
So do you find yourself spending a lot of time really educating the other commissioners about the whys and wherefores?
Oh,
of your
yes.
decision?
Especially anything related to code, compliance, or even, you know, architecture, you know, dynamics or anything like that. They do get a little bit of a lesson, as well as myself, you know, from others as well.
Peggy, what about the Salt Lake City Commission?
So on the Salt Lake City Planning Commission, it's a very, at the time, and I imagine it's pretty much the same today. Law is a common background, real estate, business ownership, and just general active citizen is the familiar composition for Salt Lake City Planning Commission. So as an architect sitting in that environment, I found myself often making sort of that tie-breaking decision, like Jared had mentioned, where the technicalities of the law and setbacks, all of those things have come forward, and the applicant has made their case. The attendees have pleaded either for or against, and we've heard all of that. And sometimes it gets very emotional, right? And so as an architect, I was able to put things on the table in more of a holistic sense, where, for example, if you were dealing with like a zoning change to increase height is a real lightning rod for a neighborhood, and in Sugar House, for example, when that height increased, I was able to portray more of a future vision for that density, and actually translate what that density might mean, and that it's more people on the street, safety, the importance of setbacks, respectful of neighborhoods, and then also not to just view it as one parcel at a time. So, for example, if you're viewing one parcel and you say, well, how high should this go, and how far should it extend in the city, like on a zoning change across the city we were talking about at the time. The perspective is, well, where do you stop it? Do you stop it at the edge of the street, and then the next across the street is the super low density? Or do you take it one, you jump across the street, so you're creating the street environment? People don't tend to think of things as a street environment or a whole environment. They think of things as parcel by parcel. And I think as architects, we are able to paint a whole picture for them.
Jackson, down in the South Valley, you guys are really busy. A lot of pressures, particularly with the reuse plan for the point. How are you guys dealing with that sprawl pressure and the housing environment, which we know across the country is just nuts right
Well, housing is nuts. And the interesting part, or the large discussion is always density. All of the residents always come in. They say HDH is going to kill everything. High density housing, which of course is relative compared to Salt Lake. And so it's very interesting to work with residents and see how those pressures affect us. We're looking at a large development of almost 6,330 units on about 800 acres as part of our town. And so it is very much sprawl in the traditional sense, but they're also looking at making it very urban. And so it's very interesting working with this developer to talk about how you create urban out of a greenfield. So there's a lot of interesting items as we have been going back and forth for almost a year on how we work, integrate urban environments into greenfield. So it's been a very interesting discussion.
Density is perhaps one of the most triggering items in any planning decision, right?
Yes, it is.
People really don't understand density in the sense that we've come to understand. And I always find it interesting when you talk to people, it's like, any place in the world, what's the best density that you've ever seen, right? And everybody goes, oh, Paris. Paris is great, right? Perfect
Paris is
density
awesome.
in Paris. And then you explain, well, that's 3 times the density we're talking about here. So what are you doing? So what examples, how do you bring out that kind of information in dealing with just the general?
We know that data into the valley examples are one of the best things, like you said, Paris, but everybody always talks about daybreak. How does it compare to daybreak? So everybody looks at, what is, everybody seems to like daybreak. And then you say, well, how does that compare to daybreak? And so interestingly, the one we're looking at, Olympia Hills, is about twice the density of daybreak.
Which still is what? How many units an acre are we talking?
It gets up to about 16 units an acre.
16?
When you spread it across the whole site. But they've got areas of density that focus on where it's a little bit higher, others where it's lower. You get down to that 5th acre lot. So it's very interesting trying to explain that with residents and how that spreads across the area.
And is the transportation conversation part of it?
That's almost the biggest part of the conversation is transportation. And we were talking earlier about other members of the planning commission. We have 2 civil engineers also on the planning commission. They have a great handle on the travel studies, the impact studies, and how those will impact neighborhoods that everybody will travel to get to this development. So, but then also looking at the big picture of how do you make that work once they're there. How it impacts us is very interesting.
Well, the other part, that the other issue in that part of the community seems to be also access to, the grocery, the convenience stores, the kind of day-to-day shopping support. And how are they integrating that?
As far as integrating the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now the interesting part is everybody, economic development, they love the idea of having more of that. But it's finding support for that and finding enough residents actually using it. They always, when all of the stores come in, they start counting rooftops. So they'll say, how many rooftops are in the area? And we visit the North Star County. And the city was probably about 20,000 residents before we got our second convenience store. So we had a whole bunch of people and one convenience store for the entire town.
Which then just spins up the transportation issues further, right?
Exactly.
You got to travel for.
Yep.
So Peggy, when you were on the Salt Lake Commission, it's around the time when tracks was really starting to take off, right?
Yes.
So how did that conversation go? Because, when you move to light rail, much less heavy rail, the impact on the neighborhood becomes a lot greater.
Yeah, I think people were just starting to realize the benefits of tracks. Sid was in. And what we were dealing with at the time, this was between 2000 and 2008, were track spurs and the benefits, and so the Sugar House spur was one of them. But one of the most interesting things was the City Creek development, which lasted over a year of plan development review. And as you recall, there is a Main Street track station right in between the 2 blocks of City Green. And it became almost, I won't say the singular reason, but a huge factor in connecting the 2 blocks of the bridge. And the bridge was discussed, that was a lightning rod, and that was actually very resisted by myself and by others on the planning commission. So we went through several rounds of what will keep people on the street, because we didn't want to suck the life off of Main Street by having a bridge and having all the traffic going in between the 2 retail blocks, pedestrian traffic, I should say. And actually the track stop became one of the reasons why people were going to remain on the street and arrive at the project in that way. So it was a completely integral conversation with that. But otherwise, I think transportation then became TOD conversations. Spurring the density of 4th South, we had that discussion between those years. So the 4th South that we see today, before the year 2000, it was like State Street. It was dead. It was lots of parking lots. It still sort of is, but the density today on 4th South and the tracks stations coming in led to all kinds of TOD initiatives with, at the time, Louis Unguzzi, who was the planning director in Salt Lake City. But yeah, it's for all kinds of things that we have to talk about. It's really exciting.
I think it's really interesting on 4 South. Most of those apartment buildings that are going in, but there are amenity spaces down there,
Yes.
which are still, they're not public access. They're not serving the street. So it doesn't seem like it's really spurred a lot of activity along the street.
Yeah, I mean, you can paint the ideal code, right? But developers don't always follow that. There's resistance, and then there's citizens who will say, well, where am I going to park? It's still the where am I going to park question. This 4 South, I would call a pedestrian atmosphere, right? And even if you put tracks on it, it still has its struggles to be truly pedestrian in its scale. So I think that's what we're seeing there and how that's all manifested over time.
Plainsville,
Plain City.
Plain City, sorry. Maybe it should be Plainsville. I don't know.
That's a good name.
Exactly.
I think though that they get upset if we changed our name.
Probably. So what are the big issues you guys are running into?
One of the biggest issues we have is we're losing the 2 bookends of our age demographics. The younger newlywed couples from ages 18 to 30 can't afford to live in our town. The average price of any home in Plain City is over $300,000, and a newlywed couple just can't afford to live there. And we're also losing the older age demographic. These people who have lived in their homes for multiple years, don't have the physical ability to take care of them, and end up moving out or going to an apartment complex, a senior housing complex, and so we noticed that we're losing those too. And one of the ways we've addressed that is by doing what's called a senior housing overlay. And we had a developer come and propose to do some senior housing and actually work with us in the city to do it. And it was kind of in a historical part where the old elementary school used to be. And so what we did was we drafted an ordinance up, and it took several months to work with us, the planning commission, the city council, and the developer to come to something that would work. And it actually took me, I was telling you earlier, it took me actually getting on CAD or Revit, drawing up the site and laying out things so that the other commissioners and council members could see how a certain amount of square footage of the structure would fit with the setbacks they were wanting or the right of ways that they were looking for. And it took me doing that to really help them visualize this.
So you don't really have much of a planning staff then?
No, we really don't have the infrastructure and the budget to afford a planning staff. we have a planner we hire part-time, and we have city staff. We rely a lot on our commissioners, experience of the commissioners to do that. We are fortunate enough to have an individual named Greg Paul, who used to be the state of Woodsman, and is an authority on land use, who comes and counsels us. He's my neighbor. He comes and counsels us on things, you know, if we have a subject that I go to the same church he does, and I'll, you know, on Sunday I'll say, hey, I have this question. He'll say, well, set up a work meeting, I'll come and help you. And that's how, you know, it's fortunate that we have that resource to come from. In fact, this Thursday we'll be talking about overlays and the limits we can do with an overlay and how far we can take them.
The overlays can get pretty tricky. Pretty fast.
They can be, and it's you can get very dependent on them. In other words, addicted to them, I guess you could say. And I worry that we're getting to that point. Because now we're in the process of discussing accessory dwelling units. You know, we have never had an ordinance on that. The state came through with legislation that basically said by October 1st, so we've got a couple more weeks to get this ordinance in effect. And we're hoping that the ADU ordinance is a step in the right direction to capture that other demographic of the young ones that are.
The ADU question has been pretty rampant across the country.
Yeah.
And Salt Lake, you guys just had to deal with that last year, right?
The ADU ordinance in Salt Lake was adopted a few years ago, actually. Well, let me back up. There has been an ADU ordinance on the books for many years, but it was so
Way back.
yeah, so overly restrictive that I think they had one ADU built in 20 years or something like that. And so about, I'm just guessing here, but I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, they redid the ADU ordinance to make it a lot more reasonable, but it's still, I'm now hearing that residents are saying, I've been trying to do this ADU and I can't because of A, B, C, or D. So there are still tweaks that need to be made to that. The other one thing that the council at the time did, I think it was really politically difficult for them to pass the ADU ordinance because there was a lot of opposition to it. So they put in a lot of restrictions that now I'm hearing, I'm not hearing the resistance to ADUs, I'm hearing the resistance to the restrictions in the ordinance from my constituents now. So people understand the benefit of them. I think in Salt Lake City and really are now frustrated at those things that probably the same people advocated for, you know, several years ago. So yeah, we're looking at potentially, we're going to need to amend some of those things, I believe. One of the things is that it was put in as a conditional use. And so conditional use is something, a tool that in order to get your approval, you have to go to the planning commission. Well, we found that every single ADU that has been applied for has been approved, and it's taken a lot of time from the planning commission's agenda. So, and staff time to just process the applications. So they're realizing that probably it wasn't worth putting in this conditional use because 100% of them have been approved since that ordinance was passed. And the conditions, and you know, you can say, well, because of the process, maybe there were changes that were made, but in this case, I don't think very many changes are made because of them going through that planning commission process. So we're looking at, or the planning director has suggested that probably we need to just make that a permitted use throughout the city. And then the state legislation also places
Right.
that.
Yeah, the state legislature getting involved in it last year. Was it helpful? Was it good? Was it evil?
Well, we already had an ordinance that met the state legislation. So for us, it wasn't, it didn't make a difference. The one thing that it will do is with internal ADUs. So the state legislation is only for internal ADUs, meaning a basement apartment or something attached to the actual structure. It's not for what we call external ADUs, but you think of like detached something in the back.
Right.
So the state legislation does make if you're doing an internal ADU in Salt Lake City, it's now permitted use. So that takes away that conditions process. But a lot of Salt Lake City lots really are set up with alleyways and deep lots that a detached ADU makes a lot of sense on the type of parcels and lot dimensions that we have. So that still is wasn't touched by the state legislation for us.
But as the council person, got a lot broader impacts than just planning purposes. So
Yeah.
put you on the spot.
Yeah,
What's the biggest one that you anticipate that's going to be an issue next year?
next year, the biggest issue, I think it's going to be continuing our discussion on affordable housing and homelessness and how those two things connect. I think, I don't know that that's specific to next year. That's probably just the biggest issue that we've been dealing with for several years. But I think that we've seen that issue increase in intensity. We're seeing more people living on our streets in Salt Lake City, and so that discussion, along with changes to how the state has the state Wayne Eater Hauser's new position, the state homeless coordinating, that's the title, but with different changes in leadership, I think that discussion is probably going to be front and center again.
So while your time on the council has been short, what's been the issue that you've had the greatest impact on as a member of the council?
So I do think that my colleagues look to me when we're doing zoning discussions. The one that comes to mind is the off-street parking ordinance. So we're looking at completely changing the off-street parking ordinance throughout the entire city. Right now, it's sort of piecemeal, zone by zone. There's a lot of exceptions that you can apply for. Some of them make sense, some of them don't. So they're looking at a complete rewrite of off-street parking. And not to speak ill of my other council members, but it's so in the weeds with what we as architects have to look at every day when we're planning projects that none of the other, we have 2 lawyers and we've got, small business, none of them understood it at all. And so I really had to okay, well, what about this zone? And what about this zone? So those, anytime it's a really sort of in the weeds zoning issue, I've tried to actually spend time taking different lots of parcels in different parts of the city of different size and pretending like I was the architect trying to develop those to see what this ordinance does, which is, I think, an extra. I don't even know that our professional planners have the time or energy to do that or the understanding of that. So that's something that I think I have felt like my responsibility, something that I've done for particularly off-street parking, but some others as well.
What's been your biggest impact, Jerry?
I think just my influence on things architecturally in the town.
One decision.
It was probably, this is going to sound funny, it was the one grocery store we have in our town. When we had a developer come in and propose a grocery store, there was some big resistance to it from our city. It's the first commercial development in our town. Well, there is a gas station, so but it was interesting. There was a lot of pushback from certain residents that resisted that grocery store coming in, and I was able to sit in development meetings and work with the architect and just work with her to kind of throw in some ideas on how to tie in aspects of Plain City, whether it was the false front architecture, around our town square that we still had, and tie that into the grocery store to give it more of a vernacular, if you will, to the city, or even just where it was located and set back so that it didn't affect any of the neighbors that were upset over it, either lighting wise or traffic wise, if you will. But that was quite an interesting thing and a battle, if you will. The interesting thing was a lot of the residents that had lived in Plain City for 10+ years wanted that grocery store in. And the ones that were the most resistant to it were the ones that had lived there less than 10 years, because they had moved out to Plain City to be in a country environment, if you will, and have that experience. Which is funny because they complain about having the hay cut early in the mornings. On the other hand, they move out here and complain about that. But it was interesting, and just I feel like that was a big contribution on that.
Peggy, what decision did you really make?
It's so hard to go to one.
That's why I'm here.
One decision. I'll tell you, you might expect it's going to be something with City Creek because that was such a huge project, and that was probably the most broad. Okay, but the one and impactful, but the one decision, and that I personally maybe had to do it. That's the question, right? Okay. Okay. When we as a commission agreed to allow heights and density in the Sugar House area, 21st South and Highland, one particular project went to full density, full outside envelope density, and I happen to live on the street where this project was, and all my neighbors were coming to me and saying, why did you let that pass? You know, what's going on? Look at what's, you know, this project now is being built and it's going to impact our neighborhood. And frankly, my house was two houses down. I'm surprised that they let me vote on this. But anyhow, I suggested to an amendment to the plan unit development, which is what they had to go through to have the density approved. To actually do a couple of setbacks towards the single-family neighborhood street, not towards the main intersection. And it lost units for that development. I ended up convincing my constituents that that was the way to go. The residents were happy that that happened, and it still met the intent of the density of the ordinance. So I would say that was my single most important, or maybe even personal decision. And I know to this day that probably that developer does not like it. So.
Well, because it is, you know, your true story. It's that
Yeah.
level of granularity that
It
you
is,
deal
yeah.
with when you're on these bodies.
Yeah.
And that's the point, I think, of having architects be engaged, is
Yeah.
that we understand those little nuances that trip into place. What about you, Jackson?
I would say one that I've had and I also credit some of the planning commissioners with me, was on the Heritage Town Center. Right in the Heritage Town Center, we've got the city hall, and a large horseshoe with the park inside the horseshoe. Outside that horseshoe, we've got 3-story residential all the way around this park, and it all faces it. So planning wise, it's been a good setup. But as the developer came in and started looking at this housing, he just thought that if he just, you know, if I can just plop some 3-story garden style apartments there, I'm great. And we sat down with him and really dug into it and said, hey, there's so much more possibility. And I think the biggest one, our planning commissioner actually wanted to go with more brownstones. Can we switch it to doing brownstone work? But the more we got into it, the piece that we really liked was this idea of live work units, a place where you can live, a place where you can work, and have a board that's part of the commercial. And so as we got looking into it and working with ADA issues and other issues, it became very apparent that we needed flats instead of brownstones. So as we did these flats on the bottom floor, people started learning about this in the area. And they love the idea of live work units on this first floor, facing the park, facing City Hall, all with parking right in front. And the developer picked up on the idea and said, yeah, we'll see if we can make this work. And they sold out almost instantly. Those live work units were the first McDonough. The developer came back and said, hey, that was amazing.
That's great.
So building those live work units on the first floor was one of the bigger impacts that we had. So it was really cool to see how working with the developer, how it improved the product and improved the city.
So let's open it up to questions. Let's see if we've got any questions in the room today. Phil.
So I have a question, just being involved like this, you've got family life, work life, you're trying to balance things. How do you balance work and life? And I don't know that you even get paid to be So that's one question. And then the second question is what do you get out of it personally that keeps you driving to stay involved, I guess?
Let's go first. Peggy.
I can go first. Oh, okay, so we're talking on that now, okay. So to that question, as a mom of 2 kids, babies, when this was happening, I was spending nights and nights at the planning commission. And to the point where one of the other commissioners actually commented that she felt sorry for my children. And yes, it was, yeah, right. And but I have to say the reward was that, well, first of all, I had a very supportive husband who was there at night, taking care. So I had family support, right? That worked. But the reward was seeing not only me for my professional career, seeing what's happening to my community and that I'm part of that community and I'm affecting that community. But I'm also able to come home and then tell my children, this is what's happening in your community. And they, today they're 21 and 25, and and I see that they are so much more engaged in what's going on their street, around them, in the city, knowing what's going on because of what I would come home over those 8 years and beyond and telling them what's happening. That really that is what's come full circle. So that's fun.
Anybody else want to add?
Go ahead.
So I could say, okay, I can say for me, I think one of the items has been, I waited a little bit until my kids were older. My youngest was a junior in high school, and that's when I started. I had a little more time at that point and was able to jump in. And it was, the main meetings are twice a month on Thursdays, so it wasn't a large draw, but I also had some time available because my kids were growing up.
I actually got my kids involved with it too, to some instances, for a service project, had my son involved a little bit. They have a youth community council now that we're doing in our school, or our city. I try to get my daughters involved in that. They don't want to. But same thing. When I come home, I talk to them about what I went through and what we were talking about. And I mean, our community's relatively small, and their friends and houses talk about some of these things, like a controversial high density development that's coming through, and so they ask me, and they want to know what my opinion is on these things. They'll go tell them what my dad says. So it's cool, and it's neat to think that I am making an impact for my children or my children's children. In a way that maybe my grandpa, my great grandpa, who now their graves are in Plain City Cemetery, I think that they did for me.
So I'll answer Phil's question, but it's going to be not the answer you probably want to hear. I don't know that I'm balancing things very well. Entirely honest. But when I was appointed, so I mean, it's all been very quick, right? So when I was appointed, I went into a 2 o'clock city council meeting and with 27 other people that were all applying for this position. So I had no serious thoughts that it was going to be me at the end of that process that was appointed. But by the end of the night, I was a city council member. And so immediately I hired a business manager. We put out job postings for architects and just immediately started to staff up and just basically change the whole way the office is running. I think this year, especially, one of my employees is here in the office, but here in the audience, by the way. I think especially this year with having to be a city council member and run an election, I don't know that I'm balancing things very well, but there's just 6 weeks left, so I feel like I can make it to that. But no, it has. I mean, it's difficult to try and balance work and public service, and I think it's going to. I think assuming I win my election and I'm still on the city council, I think the likely outcome is that I'll probably be bringing on business partners quicker than I would have otherwise, and having other people really just over, because frankly, my employees have been running the business for the last year and a half anyway, so it'll probably be trying to kind of solidify that, so.
Well, life work balance for architects is kind of getting anyway.
Yes.
That's great.
So there's.
Yeah.
Any other questions in here? Loudly, please.
How do you keep, I guess, Peggy kind of talked this a little bit with personal, like, interaction decisions. So like having like a very personal, like ideology against or for something that you may or may not be, or may or may not put into your like architecture brain, and is more just like your home brain or like your family, especially those who like live in the city that you're serving for.
So the question really is, how do we look at civic life as part of the decision-making process of whatever body you're on?
Yes.
That's it.
Definitely.
Sorry, I'm not sure I think I get the question, but so for us, we have, I mean, Salt Lake City is probably opposite of Plain City where we have tons of staff. And so if there's ever a question about if I need to recuse myself from a decision, we have a whole attorney's office that I'll just text and say, hey, look, this is my client, but it's not the project that I was working on. Do I need to recuse myself? And they'll give us a legal opinion. So if there's anything like that, we'll, yes,
Well, I think she's been more at like just being a citizen,
Yeah.
experiencing the city, you get the impacts, but now you're also on the side of making those decisions.
To answer that question, I think I have to, and when I was on planning commission for only a few months, so my experience there was limited, but on the council, it feels much more like I have to balance my sort of views of what a city should be with what my constituents are ready for. So I hope this doesn't get out too far, but like in an ideal world, I would be okay with exploring just no parking minimums throughout the city, right? I think that we need to move towards public transportation, we need to move toward walkability, but my constituents are very much not ready for that. So I have to balance what I believe in a perfect world and a perfect society is the correct decision with what I think the city and the constituency is ready for. And so that's one decision where I will not vote for no parking minimums right now, even though I think probably in the future, that's where we have to go. If we're going to clean up our air and we're going to deal with our density problems and our housing crisis, that's probably where we have to go. But it's something that I know Salt Lake City is not yet ready for. I'm hopeful that we'll continue pushing to that, but that's one thing where.
So that's kind of part of the
I think
education process.
when I was on the planning commission, it didn't affect me quite as much as it does now with people, because planning commission, they couldn't call me or email me directly. Whereas now I'm getting direct calls. There was a level of, they had to send it to the staff and then it would show up in our staff report. So now there's a level of like personal responsibility for that person's feelings that is.
So are they picking your house?
Not yet. No one has showed up to my house, but I am just waiting.
Sure.
So I think the general public is very uneducated on how the process works. Most of them. Yeah, that's a pretty generic statement, but my city has it's a city consultation page, basically, right? Every city's got one, right? But they put a lot of false information, like speaking out of emotion. A recent development came out where it's basically called My Homestead, where my family lives. Near that homestead is a big high density development that was proposed. It was up for a rezone. And the citizens thought this was the end of the world, that the city council and planning commission was automatically approving this. It hadn't even started the process. So I got on, my wife told me about it, and I got on that Facebook page and basically said, okay, I'm just going to explain to you the process, how it's going to go. It's going to go through the planning commission. The planning commission will either recommend it or deny it, and it will go to city council for approval. But people just don't understand how that actually works. whether or not you're the land use authority or not. In Plain City, the land use authority is the city council. It's pretty typical, I'm guessing, on those jurisdictions. But I don't think people understand.
It's also explains how they can engage the process, right?
Exactly.
That's the big part. Is so many people feel like, yeah, it's beyond anything I can do, but yet you can, as a normal citizen walking down the street, impact those decisions by engaging the commission.
And even know how to approach a commission as a citizen. If you're gonna come into a commission and be belligerent and combative, I don't know about you guys, but I automatically turn them off. Because I just don't want to listen to it. I don't have thick enough skin, I don't think, to deal with that. So I usually shut them off. But if you're gonna be respectful and you're gonna give me facts, I'm gonna listen to you. And it may sway my decision. And there is another development on the outskirts of our town that's unincorporated, so it goes through town. But citizens are now asking, how do we get a say about this? What do we do? You know, we're trying to educate them. County commission deal, it could be incorporated into our city in the future. How do we handle it? Here's how you could possibly get your voice heard.
You guys want to add anything, or shall I go to another question?
I can say real quick, I had an interesting one where we had this, we had a new, about 10-acre parcel of land where they're coming in to build a new neighborhood, a bunch of fairly expensive houses, but it tied into an existing street. The existing neighbors were very upset that, you know, the neighbors that, yeah, well, even their neighbor, they were, with the, you know, tying into that, they were very upset that, hey, somebody's gonna come in. And ultimately, we worked with them. There were some topography issues, all sorts of things that we worked through. And one of the difficult things with that one was the developer sold lots before they'd been platted. Or he'd taken, yeah, it was all fun. Yeah, scary stuff. Yeah. And there were a lot of people very upset. Why won't you let us build our houses? Why won't you let us move in? And then the neighbors down the street are, why are you allowing them to move in? And so we got the whole side yelling. And we worked through this. It was a process. It ended up taking almost 8 months. In the meantime, the property values soared, so it was very difficult. But the interesting part for me personally was 2 months later, my wife brings a new friend in. And I was like, oh, where are you from? She lived on that street. Hey, how's it going? So yeah, you get those personal impacts when it really does, you know, when you're serving in your city. And ultimately, she was happy because we had gone the way that she wanted. But it's, you know, there are personal interactions that do come with serving.
You have any questions?
Thank you, RK. We do have a couple questions. The first one from Bruce Fallon asking, how has your service as a citizen architect been a benefit to your professional practice? What have you learned that has benefited your work?
Peggy, you want to take that?
Well, I mean, I guess, I think that in general, it is a broad awareness of the practice I'm not sure, it seems to me that that's maybe obvious in a way. But I think really the lesson that playing that role on a commission for so long, and specifically in Salt Lake City where we practice, it was more, it brought more broad awareness to even the work that I was doing at the time, the projects we were working on at the time. But at the same time, I have to say, listening to all the citizens come during the public hearings brought a dimension of social understanding to the practice of architecture that I don't think was truly a lesson in sociology. I think that layer on my practice personally was a new lens for me to apply to then just the general good planning principles, like Paris is good because. Paris is good because it activates the citizens, but then there's the one citizen where they're not understanding this. So how am I going to design something so that citizen can engage the architecture that I'm proposing? So I think that is probably the main reason.
Everybody agrees that's kind of it. You really understand what the buttons are.
Yeah.
Push either side.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
One more question from Kyle Taft. From a world view, what is the best planned community or city in the world, in your opinion?
Wow.
Peggy, you don't have to answer that. Sure. Besides Plain City, of course.
But I wouldn't say Plank's is the best plan. Boy, that's a tough one. I don't know if I can answer that. It varies depending on what you need. As we pull in an ordinance and look at things, we pull in from various cities. I mean, the ADUs, we're looking at the ADU information packet that Salt Lake City has as a template for us to establish that ordinance. Even though granted, it's a very urban, dense setting, but it gives us a starting point for that. And that's how we handle it in Plain City, because we don't have a professional planner. So we look to examples that we feel are appropriate and good for our city as a starting point. We're talking, it's funny that, but we don't just talk about buildings and streets. We talk about horses, and cows, and chickens, and we are talking about horses. And you think, well, that's really ridiculous, but people are very passionate about their horses. And right now, the way our ordinance is written, you can have 2 horses per half acre. And I took that information to USU, and because they have an equine science department there, and they flipped out on it. They're like, I can't believe you do that. And I'm like, well, okay. So I brought that information back, and then people were upset, but I don't know if I can answer that question fully. It just varies.
Cities are messy. I mean, they're always evolving. So it's kind of what city at what point in time. There's a lot of ways.
And they're so influenced by their own culture.
Sure, they are.
Each one's, what's right for that one. Sure. And it can even affect, as far as say for us.
So sorry, Kyle, it's too hard a question. But it's a difficult question. So one last question here in the room.
Yeah, it's just going to be a follow-up on what was said about it kind of being a study in theology. How do you know, or how have you balanced understanding whether it's been hearing from a vocal minority and that's the pulse of the city, whether that's really what they're trying to say, or like, how do you know if you're really understanding the city or just hearing from the angry minority mob?
So actually knocking doors for my campaign has changed that quite a bit, because I'm now talking to just random citizens that live in my district, and I'm understanding, okay, some of these issues are the ones that I'm hearing about and others are not. So I'm not hearing about certain things on the doorsteps that I'm hearing very loudly in social media. So that's one thing, is that now that I'm actually engaging with just random citizens, that I'm knocking their doors because they will be voting. That's helped a lot. So I think, but on the so there were 2 kind of controversial land use decisions in my district that I voted for, or 2 that come to mind. And on those, I actually started making a tally of who was reaching out to me, whether they lived in the district or not, whether they were for or opposed. And on the most vocal ones, I actually found that the comments for and opposed were pretty balanced. So not that like when you email a council member that's a vote or anything like that, but I did try and keep a tally of where the comments were coming in. And I found that actually, even when they were the most sort of, there was the most opposition to them, there were still balanced comments.
Thank you, guys. I think it's great to have a lot of good insights, and maybe we would encourage people to consider joining their city councils or planning commissions. I want to thank all of you guys in the room, all of our sponsors, everybody who's attending virtually, and just want to do a shout out for our annual business meeting on Thursday, where we'll be holding the elections for the future leadership of the component. So hopefully, Friday, right? Friday afternoon. So hopefully you all can come on down and join us and participate in that election. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Guys.